Welcome back to Do No Harm, where we fight for patients and against identity politics in healthcare.
Today, we're going to be talking about medical institutions. And of course, you are medical institutions. You have a long history with medical institutions. You want to talk a little about that, your background and how much you have seen?
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, it is great to be here with you and to be able to talk about some of these really important issues in American medicine. I started in medicine back in the dark ages of 1969 is when I came to the University of Pennsylvania first as a young trainee. And they really were dark ages. It was at a time when there really wasn't a sense of social justice. There wasn't a sense of the need to make sure that every patient is treated the same. That's changed dramatically over the years, I think. And then I was trained at Penn for many years, first as an internal medicine physician and then as a nephrologist, kidney disease specialist, which I then practiced as a member of the faculty. And then in my career, I had three different kinds of positions. I was a researcher for 18 years. I had a laboratory that was funded by the National Institutes of Health where I studied kidney disease and kidney function. And then I went on to have more administrative roles, including the chief medical officer of a large healthcare system in Philadelphia, as well as eventually the interim chairman of the Department of Medicine at Penn, which went on for almost 3 years. And then my last phase of my career was in education as the associate dean for curriculum at Penn, a position I served in for a dozen years. And during that time, I've seen this transition that we're going to talk about that I think is putting American healthcare at some real risk.
So, two phrases you brought up there, social justice and curriculum. Now, I'm sure there's an extraordinary transition that you want to talk about as you got into curriculum and as social justice. Tell me your definition of social justice.
Well, I think, it's the idea that we need to be as fair as we can be to all populations of individuals that we treat in healthcare. To me, it's from the physician side of it, it's to make sure that everybody is treated equally, that everybody has the opportunity to get the best healthcare that's possible under the constraints of what can be delivered to individuals and what individuals are willing to have delivered to them. So I think from the physician standpoint, I think the idea is to really deliver care that's colorblind, that treats everyone equally and does the best that an individual can do for that patient that's in front of them as an individual patient.
So then we have your interpretation of social justice, and now we have the infiltration of the woke culture into medical institutions. What's the difference?
Well, the reason I'm sitting where I am today and having this conversation with you really goes back to a time in 2019 when I wrote an op-ed that was published in the Wall Street Journal. And that op-ed was entitled, "Take 2 Aspirins and Call Me by My Pronouns."
Okay. Let me stop you right there. What are your pronouns?
My pronouns are whatever my mother assigned to me, which was Stanley.
Call me what you want. Just don't call me late for dinner.
Yes, exactly. And that was it. It was sort of a humorous title that was supplied by the Wall Street Journal then, but the essence of it was quite serious. And the essence of it was that as the Associate Dean for Curriculum, a position I had just finished serving in at that point, I felt that American medical education had taken a turn. And it was focusing more and more on these issues of what the social conditions were in which the patients lived at the expense of learning the basic science and the clinical science that was needed to treat the patients under the best possible conditions. Now, these social conditions are important, but my feeling was physicians had no agency, no power, no expertise in dealing with correcting social issues. For example, the housing conditions of patients, the fact that there was a high incarceration rate in the Black community, the issues of climate change and what its implications were for any community. I felt those were so far outside the physician's ken that it was a real waste of time to do anything more than spend a reasonable amount of time demonstrating to students that these issues existed and then going on to train them into how to care for individual patients. So I wrote this editorial, this op-ed rather, which was about that issue. And it was I simply said, we teach enough of this information. We have to focus on teaching medical science. And the reason I wrote it at that time was I became aware of these movements nationally to further infiltrate, and I think infiltrate is the right word, these social justice issues into the medical curriculum. The AMA had started to put out programs that would focus on this. There was an organization called the Beyond Flexner Initiative, which was an echo of Abraham Flexner's work back at almost 120 years ago, where he reviewed American medical education and decided it needed a real upgrade at that time. It was it was non-professional, it was non-academic at that time in the early 20th century, and there was a big change that occurred. Well, this organization wanted to change medical education again, and this time to make it so that the focus was much more on social issues and much less on medical science. So all these issues led me to worry about the future of medical education. I was at the end of my academic career, my career as the Associate Dean of Curriculum, and I felt that this was a real issue that I was concerned about. And it elicited a dramatic response. The response was so great that the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial about the response to me, because at that point, cancel culture had not really reared its ugly head as much as it has today. This was before the pandemic. It was before some of these examples that people are quite familiar with had occurred at other undergraduate institutions. And it occurred against me, and I became sort of a pariah at my institution. I was denounced for these views. And in fact, my view was simply that the curriculum should focus on basic medical science. This was not, acceptable. You asked about social justice and curriculum. So my view is, yes, these social issues are important, but they're important to politicians. They're important to social workers. They're important to patients, but they're not really anything under the control of physicians. Excuse me. And therefore, it's important that we not expect physicians to interact there. And if I can just add, there have been studies now that have shown that physicians have become very frustrated who are interested in social issues because they've come to realize, in fact, they've learned more and more about social issues, and in fact, there's very little, if anything, they can do about them. There was an article in Stat News, which is an online publication that illustrated the fact that physicians who felt very, very concerned about social issues were very, very frustrated. It was contributing to their burnout even, because they felt they could do nothing about the fact that there wasn't a supermarket near their patient's home so that they could recommend certain foods as part of the therapy of any given condition. So this has been our concern, in Do No Harm, that we want medicine to be applied equally. We want medicine to be applied under the best scientific conditions. And we don't want physicians to be put under the pressure of feeling like they have to worry about social conditions when, in fact, they have, as I said, no expertise and no ability to really make those changes.
So when you started getting this response after the Wall Street Journal op-ed that you wrote, how did you react? Did you double down? Did you pull back? What did you do about this?
I was amused first. I really was, because it was so absurd.
Right.
And it gave me insight to how the social media can just represent people that mostly anonymously, some not, were willing to really attack other individuals for their thoughts. There's a Salman Rushdie quote that's been going around lately after the very horrible attack on him. about how inability to tolerate opposing points of view represents the death of the freedom of thought. And I think, I sort of felt amused, but then very sad, really, about this response. And unlike many physicians, again, I was at the end of my career. I fully recognized that it doesn't take much courage to make these kinds of statements and take these positions when there's no risk of my job, there's no risk of my family's financial security, which many physicians are very, very worried about, even though they're concerned, as I was, about some of these same issues. But then I decided, I really need to expand on these views, and I wrote a book. That was my next response to this. My book ended up being entitled, again, Take 2 Aspirins and Call Me by My Pronouns. Again, it wasn't my choice of books. I wanted it to sound much more serious and monumental. That's the arrogance, I think, that creeps in when you start doing things like this. But the publisher said no. He said he wanted to make sure that people would want to buy the book. So therefore,
it is
the name
eye-catching.
was rather trivial. I appreciate it because the book has nothing directly to do with any gender issues at all, but more reflecting this idea of woke has crept into medicine. And so that I spent the next year and a half writing the book.
So who is pushing this woke agenda and approach in the medical institutions now?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. There was a wonderful article in a City Journal that I read by one of the editors there. And the article asked the question, what's the origin of wokeness? Where did it really come from? And he posited, Theodore Kupfer was the author, and he posited about 6 or 7 possible sources, ranging from idealism, that people think this represents a way of having a sort of a utopian world where everyone is treated perfectly and everything comes out perfectly equal for every individual, all the way to greed, that corporations were signing on to woke ideas because they thought there was some money-making opportunity here with new products and new approaches that would attract perhaps a new audience to them. And everything in between, greed and idealism. Some of it was representing kind of a proto-Marxist kind of approach to the world, where everyone, to each according to his needs and from each according to his capabilities. And I think in my personal view in medical education is the students of the 60s, where many of these ideas of attacking hierarchies in education came from, when students revolted against mostly the fact that they were going to be drafted into the Vietnamese War and push back against the American government and sort of the sense of the hierarchies in society because they felt powerless to be called up and to serve in a war that they felt was unjust, and mostly they felt that they weren't willing to give their lives for. The famous Muhammad Ali phrase, "I ain't got nothing against them Viet Cong." And I think that's the way American society felt. Many of the students, they felt like they had no real argument against this problem that was many thousands of miles away, and they resented it. And that led to student uprisings. Those students are now the individuals in charge of academic institutions. Mm-hmm. They were bright, they were very aggressive, and they've become academic leaders. So I think that's part of it. Part of it has been, I think, a feeling by other leaders that don't particularly share these ideas, that they're not willing to go to the bother of having students sit in their offices, having staff disrupt the running of the organization. And in healthcare, certainly these are very complicated, large organizations. They serve very diverse audiences and diverse workforces. And this seemed to be a much easier path to accept these issues and to profess to have these very woke, if you will, ideas of social justice and equity, meaning equal outcomes for all individuals, that was much easier than saying no. Our job is to do the best we can for every patient and make sure that every patient gets optimal care and not treat people as parts of a group, but treat them as individuals that have very individual needs and wants and fears, and treat them in that sort of fashion. So I think it's a combination of this long history of social activity by students and this simpler path for the current leadership not to have conflict in their organization.
Well, as you know, we've talked about this before. I'm from South Africa, and I grew up under apartheid in South Africa. And I emigrated in 1986, no voice, no vote. And, this country's been my dream. And then to watch the groupthink and the group classifications and racial classifications that I went through in South Africa, infiltrating here, has been the motivation behind me joining you in this. And I'm really honored to be a part of this. And I hope that as we go forward, we persuade more people of the mistake that they're making in this kind of thought and process. So I really appreciate you being here. And that concludes today's episode. We thank you for joining us and the mission of this great organization. Please visit donoharmmedicine.org. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, and thank you for being here.